The types of human awakenings we are about to move through span hundreds of thousands of years. The awakening narrative is not limited to the spiritual ones. Humans have witnessed different awakenings and gone through various experiences to reach the level of spirituality. These awakenings cross continents, civilizations, and revolutions of thought. They involve figures whose names you recognize and forces so old they predate naming entirely. And yet, by the time we reach the end, what you will find is that none of it was really about them. It was about you. Every phase of awakening that humanity has passed through as a species is also a phase that a single human being is capable of going through in the course of life. The child who is all body and hunger, purely in the grip of need with no observer watching from above, turns into an adolescent who suddenly realizes that other people have inner lives as complex as their own. The adult who reaches for meaning in story, in religion, in the myths, starts questioning beliefs. These phases do not end. They accumulate. They layer. The person who has moved into the later phases of rational inquiry or psychological self-examination does not leave the earlier phases behind. They carry them, sometimes consciously, more often not. We are all of this, the full range. What changes, what genuinely moves, in a person or in a civilization, is where the center of gravity sits. Which phase is doing most of the organizing, and which layer of awareness is running the show? That is the whole exploration of this audiobook. So, as we move through these 8 phases or types together, listen for yourself in each of them. There is a particular kind of listening required for what follows in this audiobook, not the listening of someone gathering information to file away, but something closer to what a physician does when they place a stethoscope against a chest and go quiet, listening for what the body is saying beneath the surface noise. That kind of listening requires the willingness to be surprised, to hear something in these pages that does not fit your current story about yourself, to let that discomfort sit for a moment before the mind rushes to resolve it, because the phases we are about to describe are not merely historical, they are alive in you, right now, competing for authority. The question that runs under this audiobook is which phase is currently doing the most organizing in your life? This is the only question that leads anywhere real, and that is the only way this audiobook becomes anything more than a compilation of mere information. Phase 1. The physical awakening. This phase of awakening starts with darkness. The darkness of a world with no artificial light, no written language, and no accumulated knowledge beyond what the body has learned to do to stay alive. Moving because movement meant food. Stopping because stopping meant rest, shelter, or danger, assessed and survived. There was no inner monologue. This is the part that is genuinely difficult to imagine from where we stand, because the inner monologue is so constant, so woven into what we call being awake, that its absence seems like unconsciousness. But it was not unconsciousness. These were not sleepwalking creatures. Their senses were acute. Their responses to the environment were sophisticated, their social bonds were real, but there was no layer of awareness hovering above experience and commenting on it. No voice saying, "This is happening, I am feeling this," or "What does it mean?" Experience was simply happening, the organism was responding, and the gap between stimulus and response was occupied by immediate animal intelligence. Charles Darwin understood something essential about this state that is still underappreciated, that the intelligence operating here is not primitive in the sense of defective or incomplete. It is precisely calibrated for what it needs to do. The body that reads the shift in wind direction before the conscious mind has registered that the wind has changed. The hand pulls back from the heat before the pain signal has finished traveling to the brain. These are not failures of awareness. They are a form of awareness so integrated with the world that it does not need the detour through self-reflection to function. Yuval Noah Harari, in *Sapiens*, describes this early human existence with a phrase that lodges. According to him, we were, for most of our history, an animal of no particular significance. Not dominant or exceptional. We were somewhere in the middle of the food chain, scavenging more than hunting, more often prey than predator. The body knew this. Alertness was not a practice or a discipline. It was the baseline condition of existing in a world that could kill you in dozens of ways before noon. What ended this phase was not a sudden event, but a gradual one, or perhaps a series of gradual ones accumulating until something tipped. Around 70,000 years ago, something shifted in human cognition that researchers call the cognitive revolution. Harari uses this term to describe the emergence of a new kind of thinking, the ability to speak and think about things that do not exist. To communicate, we didn't just say there is a lion near the river, we started to say the lion is the spirit guardian of our ancestors. To hold in mind not just what is present, but what is possible, what is feared. This capacity imagination, in its fullest and most dangerous sense, is the doorway between phase 1 and everything that follows. It is the crack through which the inner life begins to pour. But before we walk through that doorway, something needs to be said about what we are leaving behind, because this is one of the central misunderstandings about human development. Phase 1 does not end. It continues, running in the background of every subsequent phase like an operating system that predates the software it now runs underneath. The evidence for this is everywhere in modern life. The fight-or-flight response that fires in the body during a crisis at work, that is phase 1. The craving for sugar and fat that makes modern nutritional discipline so difficult, that is phase 1. The body obeys ancient instructions about caloric scarcity that are no longer accurate. The tribal loyalty that makes people defend the positions of their political group against evidence, that is, phase 1's social bonding mechanism, now attached to abstractions. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Steven Pinker has argued, controversially, that human violence has actually declined across history. He says that we are, statistically, living in the most peaceful era our species has known. He may be right about the statistics, but what the statistics cannot capture is the degree to which phase 1's threat detection machinery is running continuously in the vast majority of people. The same awakening that happened to our physical self is now generating a low-level state of vigilance and reactivity that shapes perception. The body that evolved to survive on the savannah is now sitting in an open-plan office under fluorescent lighting for 8 hours a day, and the mismatch between the environment the system was built for and the environment it now operates in is one of the quiet catastrophes of modern life. Phase 1 of our awakening is not the enemy, it is the foundation. The question is whether the foundation is running the building or whether the building has learned to rest on the foundation without being determined by it. The challenge of human awakening, from phase 2 onward, is not to silence the body's knowing, but to add something above it that can hear it clearly and respond rather than simply react. The question the survival phase asks is simply, are you alive? Phase 2, the rise of ego. Imagine the first time a human being looked at their own reflection in still water and recognized it, understood in some wordless way that the face looking back was the same face that looked out, that there was a self here, a specific and bounded self, distinct from the water, distinct from the trees reflected beside it, distinct from everything that was not it. We cannot date this moment. It did not happen on a random day. It happened gradually, over thousands of years, as the cognitive structures that make self-awareness possible assembled themselves layer by layer in the evolving human brain. But it happened. And when it did, it changed everything, because it introduced into the universe that had not existed before a being that knew it existed. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has spent decades trying to understand what self-awareness actually is at the level of brain function, and his conclusions are both rigorous and quietly verifying of what the contemplative traditions have always intuited. He distinguishes between what he calls the proto-self, the body's continuous, largely unconscious monitoring of its own state, and the core self, which is the fleeting, moment-to-moment sense of being a subject of experience. And then, above both of these, the autobiographical self, the narrative, which is the story a person constructs and maintains about who they are across time. What is fascinating about Damasio's framework is that the higher layers depend on the lower ones, but also obscure them. The autobiographical self, the story we tell about ourselves, is built on top of the raw experience of existing. But once it is established, it tends to become the thing we identify with most completely. We become our story. We protect our story. We organize our perceptions around our story, and anything that challenges the story produces a threat. This is the gift and the trap of this phase of awakening. The gift is obvious. A self-aware being can plan, learn from the past, imagine futures, and work toward them. It can feel loneliness, which is the first step toward connection to something higher, can feel guilt, which is the beginning of conscience. The trap is equally obvious once you see it, and nearly invisible until then. The self that has emerged to organize experience begins almost immediately to confuse itself with experience. To believe that its story about the world is the world, to mistake the map for the territory it is mapping. Every human conflict, from the domestic arguments to the decades-long war between nations that have constructed incompatible narratives, has its root in this confusion. In the self that formed to help us navigate reality, becoming so convinced of its own narrative that reality needs to be bent to fit. The philosopher Daniel Dennett describes human consciousness as a kind of user illusion, the simplified interface through which a vastly complex system presents itself to itself. The analogy is to a computer's desktop. The icons you see, drag, and click are not the actual operations of the machine. They are a representation designed to be usable. Similarly, the self you experience as you is not the totality of what you are. It is a representation, a very useful one, a deeply compelling one, but a representation nonetheless. This is not a comfortable idea. It was not comfortable when Dennett proposed it, and it is not comfortable now, because the self does not like being told it is an interface. That deep, structural resistance to being seen through is what we carry from phase 2 forward into every subsequent phase of awakening. It is the fundamental friction, the thing that makes the work of becoming more conscious harder than it sounds and more necessary than we usually admit. The child who has just discovered that they are a self, who has just learned to say I, is one of the most astonishing things in the world to observe. Something lights up. Some new dimension of experience becomes available. And then, almost immediately, the defending begins. Mine, I want, I don't want. Watch a 2-year-old for an afternoon. You are watching the rise of the ego self, unmediated. And if you are honest, you are also watching yourself. Phase 3. The Rise of Mythic Mind. Around 35,000 years ago, in a series of caves across what is now southern France, human beings descended into the deepest, darkest chambers they could find and painted the walls. They painted with ochre, charcoal, and manganese. They painted bison, horses, and rhinos, and used stencils of their hands created by blowing pigment over them. They painted in the flickering light of animal fat lamps, which means the animals on the walls moved as the light moved, which was almost certainly deliberate. They went deep into caves that required crawling through narrow passages in total darkness to reach. They painted in places where no one could easily see, which means the painting was not primarily about being seen. Nobody knows exactly why. Every answer given is a projection of our own frameworks onto a consciousness we can only approximate from the outside. But the fact that they did it at all, that they used precious resources and significant effort to make images in permanent darkness, tells us something deep. By 35,000 years ago, human beings were living in two worlds simultaneously, the world of what is and the world of symbolism. The anthropologist and mythologist Joseph Campbell spent his entire career mapping what he called the one story that all human cultures tell in endlessly varied forms. The hero leaves the ordinary world. The hero descends into darkness, faces a trial, and encounters something that cannot be encountered in the ordinary world. Then, the hero returns, changed, carrying something back. Campbell called this the monomyth, the single narrative template beneath every creation story, every religious tradition, and every fairy tale. What Campbell was identifying was not simply a literary pattern. He was identifying the shape of the human mind's relationship to its own depths. Every culture that has ever existed has had its version of this story, because every culture is composed of human beings who have the same basic interior architecture. The Sumerian story of Gilgamesh descending to find the plant of immortality, Orpheus going into the underworld for Eurydice, Christ in the tomb for 3 days. The Aboriginal Australian concept of the dream time, a dimension of reality that is not past or present, but continuously underlying, accessible through ritual, story, and the correct quality of attention. The scholar of religion, Mircea Eliade, made a distinction that illuminates this type of awakening that humans experienced more precisely. The distinction between sacred time and profane time. Profane time is linear. It moves from past through present into future. It accumulates, it ages, it ends. Sacred time is circular and repeatable. It is the time of myth, which is not once upon a time in the sense of long ago, but once upon a time in the sense of a time that keeps happening. This is available to be stepped into through the right ritual or the right story. The mythic mind lives in sacred time. It understands the world not as a collection of facts, but as a drama, not as a mechanism to be explained, but as a story to be participated in. In the mythic mind, the rain does not fall because of atmospheric pressure differentials. The rain falls because the sky is generous, or angry, or in conversation with the earth. The relationship between things is primary. The mechanism is secondary, or irrelevant. This is easy to condescend to from the position of Phase 5's rational inquiry, and that condescension is one of the great intellectual errors of the modern world. Because the mythic mind was not making mistakes that better information would correct, it was doing something that better information cannot do. It was locating human beings inside a meaningful universe, giving them a story in which their suffering was not random and their kindness was not pointless. This gave them a way to face death that was not simply annihilation. The neurologist and writer Oliver Sacks observed that patients who suffered damage to the left hemisphere of the brain, the hemisphere associated with linear, logical processing, would sometimes develop a richly mythological relationship with their own illness. Tumors became invaders from another world. Recovery became a hero's journey. Sacks found this not pathological but revealing that the narrative, meaning-making impulse is so fundamental to human consciousness that it will assert itself even through the most disorienting circumstances. The myth is not a failed attempt at science. It is a different instrument, built for a different purpose. Science asks, how does this work? Myth asks, what does this mean for how I should live? These are not competing questions, they are perpendicular ones. And the tragedy of the modern world is that we have largely lost the ability to hold both simultaneously. To know that the rain is caused by atmospheric pressure differentials, and to also understand what the rain means, what relationship it has to grief, to renewal, to the land's need and the body's need, requires moving fluidly between two modes of knowing that the modern world tends to treat as mutually exclusive. Something is lost in that mutual exclusion, the sense of being inside a meaningful world rather than simply a functional one. We've lost the difference between a universe that is running and a universe that is saying something. The mythic mind knew that it was inside something that was saying something. It did not know how to speak about this in the language of mechanism, but it knew it with a completeness and a certainty that the subsequent phases of rational inquiry, whatever their power, have not fully replaced. The hunger to be inside a meaningful story, to have one's suffering mean something, to face death with more than the cold comfort of biological necessity, this hunger does not disappear when the myths become incredible. It goes underground. It emerges in distorted forms. It attaches itself to political ideologies, celebrity cults, the strange quasi-religious fervor that surrounds certain brands, sports teams, and online communities. We do not leave the mythic mind behind when we learn to think scientifically. We carry it with more refinement. Phase 4. The Inner Awakening. For most of human history, the search for truth pointed outward. The gods were in the sky, in the mountain, in the river, in the animal that appeared at the right moment. Reality was something that came at you from outside, from above, from the incomprehensible movements of celestial bodies. The human being was a receiver, a responder, a participant in a drama whose authorship lay elsewhere. Then, roughly between 800 and 200 BCE, something happened across multiple civilizations simultaneously that the philosopher Karl Jaspers named the Axial Age. In China, Lao Tzu and Confucius were born. In the Indian region, the Upanishadic sages. In Nepal, Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha. In Persia, Zoroaster. In Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These figures did not know of each other. They were separated by thousands of miles and radically different cultural contexts, and yet they arrived, through different routes, at something recognizably similar. The idea that the source of meaning and truth was not out there, in the sky, or in the ritual or the king's authority. It was in here, in the quality of one's own attention, in the examined life. This convergence across cultures was not a coincidence. It was a response to specific historical conditions, the collapse of older tribal certainties, the rise of trade, and exposure to radically different ways of living, the pressure of empires that made the old local mythologies suddenly look provincial. When your cosmology has to compete with someone else's cosmology, neither one can remain quite as absolute as it was before. The question turns inward because the outward answers have lost their self-evidence. Siddhartha Gautama was a prince, a man who had everything the world offers, wealth, status, beauty, family, and still he found that none of it touched the thing that needed touching. He spent years with ascetics, pushing the body to its absolute limits, as if the truth could be starved out of the flesh. It did not work. He sat under a tree and resolved not to move until he understood something. What he found under that tree was not a new metaphysical theory. It was something more immediate and more radical, that the suffering which organizes human life is not caused by circumstances. It is caused by the relationship of the mind to circumstances, by craving what is not present, by the restlessness of one's own mind. This is an idea that sounds simple and hard to actually inhabit. It has been elaborated into an entire civilization of thought over 2,500 years. Monasteries have been built around it. Wars have been fought in its name, which is one of the more ironic things in human history. But the core of it is almost embarrassingly direct. The mind creates its own cage, and the cage is built not from circumstances, but from the mind's reaction to circumstances. Jesus of Nazareth, arriving in a different corner of the world roughly 5 centuries later, was pointing at something that rhymes with this at a frequency so precise that scholars have spent centuries arguing about whether the resonance is coincidental or causal. His central teaching is not a theology, it is an instruction about inner stillness. Love as a quality of presence, not as a feeling or an obligation. The kingdom of heaven is something interior and immediate, not a future reward. He was not speaking about an afterlife. He was speaking about a quality of awareness available in this moment, to this person, right now. Alan Watts spent his life translating between the Eastern contemplative traditions and the Western mind, and he had a gift for finding the sentence that cuts. He returned, again and again in his lectures and writing, to a single unsettling possibility, that the self is not a fixed thing you are obligated to carry forward, but something that arises moment to moment and can be seen through. His idea is pointing at something much more radical than self-improvement, the possibility of misidentifying, even momentarily, with the narrative self that Phase 2 built. This is what inner awakening offered humans, not a new set of beliefs to replace the old ones, but something completely different in kind. This phase gave humans the possibility of turning the light of awareness back on awareness itself. From this phase of awakening, the question changed from what is out there to what is happening inside and what is witnessing it. These questions cannot be answered by a mythic story, ritual, or by scientific measurement. It can only be answered by the kind of direct inner attention that Buddha practiced, that Sufi mystics encoded in their poetry, that Meister Eckhart risked his life to preach in medieval Germany. The turn inward was not a retreat from the world, it was the discovery that the world humans were encountering was always being filtered through a lens they had never examined. From this point forward, humans have seen the awakening of different kinds, but the inner awakening still remains as the highest level of spiritual awakening. Phase 5, the rational awakening. In 1633, a 68-year-old man knelt before the Inquisition in Rome and recanted what he knew to be true. The name was Galileo Galilei, who had spent decades observing the sky through his telescope and recording what he saw: the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus. The surface of the moon is cratered and irregular, rather than the perfect smooth sphere that theology required, and the movement of the earth around the sun, rather than the reverse, which the Church had taught as a sacred fact for over 1,000 years because the Bible, read in a particular way, seemed to require it. He recanted. He said the words they required him to say. He was nearly 70, in poor health, and not interested in being burned. The story, probably apocryphal, but resonant enough to survive, is that as he rose from his knees after the recantation, he muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Whether he said it or not, the universe was not paying attention to what the Inquisition required of Galileo. The Earth continued to move around the sun, the moons of Jupiter continued their orbits. Reality remained indifferent to the institutional need for it to be otherwise. This is the essential character of Phase 5. Reality is indifferent to our need for it to be otherwise. And the rational awakening is the slow, painful, frequently dangerous process of learning to let that indifference teach us rather than defend against it. René Descartes, alone in a stove-heated room in the German town of Neuburg in the winter of 1619, decided to doubt everything he had ever been told. He had retreated there from the cold with nothing but time and silence, and he used both to strip away every assumption, every inherited belief, and every apparently self-evident fact. He wanted to find something that could not be doubted, some foundation solid enough to build on, and the method he chose was radical skepticism. Strip away everything that could be wrong and see what remains. What remained, famously, was the thinking itself. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The one thing he could not doubt was that doubting was happening, and this, for Descartes, was the bedrock. The significance of this moment in intellectual history is not the specific conclusion Descartes reached. Philosophers have argued with, I think therefore I am, for 4 centuries, and will likely continue. The significance is the method, the willingness to place one's own reason above inherited authority. To say, I will not accept this because I was told to accept it. I will accept only what I can verify through my own inquiry. This was genuinely dangerous. Not metaphorically dangerous, actually dangerous, in the way that the Inquisition had recently demonstrated with Galileo and had demonstrated more lethally with Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600 for, among other things, suggesting that the universe might contain infinite worlds. The courage required to question publicly in that era was of a different order than the courage required to question in a modern university seminar. It was the courage of someone who understood that the institution they were challenging had the legal authority to end their life. Isaac Newton, working in Cambridge in the latter half of the 17th century, extended this method to the universe at large, with results that still feel almost impossible. He described the same mathematical laws governing the fall of an apple and the orbit of the moon. He showed that the universe was not a collection of different realms operating on different principles, the earthly and the celestial, but a single system, operating everywhere on the same terms, describable by the same equations. The sky was no longer a different kind of place. It obeyed the same laws as the ground beneath your feet. This was not just a scientific discovery, it was a psychological revolution. Because one of the things that made authority so powerful in the pre-rational world was the inaccessibility of the heavens. The stars were where the gods were. They were beyond examination. They were sacred precisely because they were beyond reach. Newton reached them, and by reaching them, brought them down into the same universe as everything else, the universe of observation, measurement, and falsifiable hypothesis. The Enlightenment that followed roughly the 18th century across Europe was the social and political expression of what Descartes, Newton, and Galileo had demonstrated was possible in science. If inherited authority could not be trusted in matters of natural fact, why should it be trusted in matters of governance? If the Church could be wrong about the solar system, why should kings rule by divine right? The American and French revolutions were, among many other things, applications of the scientific method to political organization, hypothesis, test, revision, based on observable outcomes rather than inherited doctrine. This phase gave humanity an enormous gift, the ability to distinguish between what we want to be true and what is actually true. This is harder than it sounds. The wish to believe is powerful. The comfort of the inherited explanation is real. The social cost of questioning publicly held certainties is significant. Phase 5 built the intellectual tools to do it anyway, and in doing so, extended human life expectancy, ended certain categories of suffering that had been accepted as natural and inevitable, and mapped the physical universe with a precision that would have seemed like magic to every previous phase of human consciousness. But the rational awakening has tremendous possibilities, with the same level of risk involved. The risk is the belief that the method of rational inquiry, which works so brilliantly for external phenomena, works equally well for internal ones. It may assume that the self can be understood the same way the solar system can be understood, and the territory of human interiority is simply another domain awaiting the right measurement tools. It might claim that consciousness is ultimately reducible to chemistry, and the meaning is ultimately reducible to evolutionary advantage. Maybe it will reach there one day, but will that be the right way? It's up to you to decide. Phase 6. Psychological awakening. You think you know why you did what you did. You think the reasons you give for your choices are the actual reasons. You think the story you tell about yourself is an accurate description of what is operating underneath. What if most of it isn't yours? This is not a random question. It came from a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud, who began asking it in the 1890s. What Freud proposed and what subsequent decades of psychological research have complicated and refined, but not fundamentally refuted, is that human beings are largely governed by processes they cannot see, cannot directly access, and would strongly prefer to believe do not exist. The unconscious, in Freud's formulation, is not simply the place where forgotten things go. It is an active system, with its own logic and its own goals, which are frequently in conflict with the goals the conscious mind believes it is pursuing. The examples include the person who genuinely cannot understand why they keep choosing the same kind of partner who disappoints them in the same kind of way. The person whose stated commitment to their creative work is somehow never quite enough to make them actually sit down and do it. The parent who swore they would never speak to their children the way they were spoken to, and hears, with horror, their own parent's voice coming out of their mouth. These are not failures of willpower. They are the unconscious doing what the unconscious does, running its programs, regardless of what the conscious mind has decided. Carl Jung extended Freud's map of the interior in ways that took it somewhere Freud was not entirely comfortable going. Where Freud's unconscious was primarily personal, the repository of repressed experiences, unacceptable desires, memories too painful to hold in awareness, Jung's unconscious was collective. It contained, he proposed, patterns that are not derived from individual experience but are inherited as part of the structure of the human psyche itself. He called these patterns archetypes: the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the great mother, etc. These were not ideas, but something more like recurring shapes in the interior realm. Jung's shadow is particularly relevant to a discussion of awakening. The shadow, as he described it, is not simply the parts of oneself that one has repressed because they are socially unacceptable. It is everything in the psyche that has not been brought into consciousness, and because it is unconscious, it is projected outward. The person who is unconsciously angry encounters anger everywhere. The person who is unconsciously afraid encounters a world that is threatening at every turn. The person who is unconscious of their own capacity for cruelty will find cruelty everywhere they look, in others, in institutions, in history, and will be genuinely baffled when anyone suggests they might contain some of it themselves. One does not become enlightened, Jung wrote, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This sentence is one of the most useful things written about psychological development in the 20th century. It cuts against the entire spiritual economy of aspiration, the idea that growth is a matter of reaching towards something higher, something better, something more luminous. Jung is saying something different, that the movement toward wholeness is, at least in part, a movement downward, into what you have not looked at, into what has been operating below the floor of awareness, shaping your choices and your perceptions and your relationships in ways you cannot see precisely because you have not looked. What does this look like in practice? Not in theory, but in the actual texture of a person's life. It looks like the moment when you catch yourself about to say something that you recognize, with a small shock, as exactly what your mother or father would have said in the same situation, and instead of immediately saying it, you pause. You feel the full weight of the impulse. You ask where it comes from, not as a therapy exercise, as a genuine inquiry into something operating in you that you did not choose and did not know was there. It looks like noticing that the person who irritates you most in your workplace possesses, in exaggerated form, a quality you dislike in yourself. And instead of being irritated, being curious. What is this mirror showing me? It looks like the sustained, uncomfortable, frequently humbling process of discovering that the self you believed was directing your life has been, in significant measure, being directed by forces it did not know about. The gift of psychological awakening is the discovery that you are more than you thought you were, more complex, more layered, more interesting, and if you are willing to look, more capable of change. The intellectual grasp of a psychological pattern can become, paradoxically, another buffer against truly feeling it. Because the understanding gives the mind something to do with the discomfort that is more tolerable than actually sitting inside the discomfort. Jung was aware of this. He used the word individuation to describe the actual process of psychological development, and he was careful to distinguish it from analysis in the narrower sense. Individuation is not primarily a cognitive achievement. It is an experiential one, the gradual, often painful process of integrating what has been split off, not just understanding that it was split off. The difference between knowing that you are afraid and feeling the specific texture of the fear that has been driving your choices without your knowledge. One of these is information. The other is transformation. Phase 7. The Present Awakening. We've reached an important question. Who is aware? This question points at the container rather than the contents, at the awareness itself rather than at what awareness is currently holding. Try it for a moment, not as an intellectual exercise, as an actual experiment. Notice the thought you are having right now. Now notice that you are noticing it. Who is doing that second noticing? If you followed that instruction honestly, something slightly strange may have happened. There was a moment, perhaps only a fraction of a second, in which the ordinary running commentary of the mind went quiet. Not because you suppressed it, but the attention briefly turned back on itself, and the commentary lost its automatic grip. That moment, that fraction of a second of what is sometimes called bare awareness, is what this phase is pointing at. The teacher and writer Eckhart Tolle has reached more people with this recognition than perhaps anyone in recent decades. His own story is instructive. He was a doctoral student at Cambridge in his late 20s, in a state of such profound despair that he later described waking up in the night, unable to live with himself. He found himself wondering, if I cannot live with myself, who are the two? The one who cannot bear it, and the one who is being born, the experiencer and the experienced, the watcher and the watched. That split, the moment of involuntary doubling, was the beginning of something he spent the next years trying to understand. What he eventually concluded, and what he has spent decades communicating in various forms, is that the ordinary state of human consciousness is a case of mistaken identity. We believe we are the stream of thoughts and feelings that flows through awareness. We are not. We are the awareness itself, temporarily convinced it is the stream. Sam Harris, approaching the same territory from a rigorously secular direction, makes a point that is worth sitting with. He argues that the narrative self, or the I, at the center of subjective experience, is not what it appears to be on examination. That is, in his phrase, an appearance that arises in consciousness and can be seen through. Not destroyed, not eliminated, only seen through. It's like you were mistaking a window for a wall, and when you clearly see it, you become aware of the truth. What changes when this recognition lands is the relationship to suffering, not the elimination of suffering. The relationship to it changes because suffering requires a self to suffer. And when the self is seen as something arising in awareness rather than as the awareness itself, the suffering's grip changes. The contemplative traditions have been pointing at this for thousands of years. From the inside, what this phase of awakening offers is the beginning of a more widespread, less institutionally mediated access to this recognition. The understanding that the quality of awareness can itself become an object of inquiry, and that this inquiry is not separate from daily life, not reserved for monks and mystics, not dependent on believing the right things. It is available in the kitchen, in the traffic jam, in the argument, and in the moment just before the habitual reaction fires. It is worth being honest about how rarely that gap appears in most lives, not because people lack the intelligence or the spiritual interest, but the conditions of modern life are almost perfectly designed to close it. This phase does not require a monastery. It does not require years of formal meditation practice, though that can help. What it requires is the willingness to stop and go within. The teacher, Jiddu Krishnamurti, used to say that the observer is the observed. The distance you think exists between you and your anger, you and your fear, you and your longing, is the illusion. When you are angry, you are the anger, not someone watching it from a safe remove. The moment you see this, something changes in the relationship to the emotion. It is no longer a thing you have, it is a thing you are, temporarily. Phase 8. The Emerging Awakening. We are, right now, in the middle of something whose shape we cannot fully see because we are inside it. Every generation has felt itself to be at a hinge point. Many were wrong. But there is something about the convergences currently underway in science, in contemplative practice, in communication, in the accelerating pressure of global crises that suggests a genuinely novel situation, even if its meaning is not yet clear. The philosopher Ken Wilber has spent decades building what he calls an integral framework, an attempt to map human knowledge and experience in a way that honors the genuine insights of every phase of awakening without collapsing them into each other. The mythic mind was not replaced by the rational mind. The rational mind added a new dimension, while the mythic mind continued to operate, mostly below the surface. The psychological awakening did not replace rational inquiry. It added interior depth to the rational structure. Each phase is nested inside the next, not eliminated by it. This is a generous and, in many ways, accurate description of how consciousness actually develops in individuals and in cultures. The person who has moved through serious psychological work carries all their previous phases of development with them. The scientist who has practiced meditation for 20 years does not stop being a scientist. The mythic impulse does not disappear in the person who has learned to question its literal claims. Everything is still there, organized differently, given different amounts of authority in different situations. What Phase 8 points toward is something that is just beginning to become visible, the possibility of a consciousness that is genuinely integrated across these dimensions. That can be present in the body without being trapped in it. That can use rational inquiry without being imprisoned by it. That can hold mythic meaning without being deceived by its literalism. That can look at the unconscious without being organized by it. That can touch the awareness beneath thought without losing the ability to think. Terence McKenna, for all his eccentricities and his willingness to go places that made serious academics uncomfortable, asked a question that is genuinely worth holding. What if the evolution of consciousness is not something that happens to us, but something we participate in? Not passively, through the slow grind of biological time, but actively, through the quality of our attention, the rigor of our inquiry, the willingness to be changed by what we encounter. This question is not new. It has been asked, in different forms, by every figure we have moved through in this audiobook. By Siddhartha under his tree, by Descartes by his fire, by Jung mapping the territory of the shadow, by every unnamed person in every unnamed cave who descended into the dark to paint something that mattered, even though no one would see it. What is new or newly possible is the scale at which this question is being asked simultaneously. The contemplative traditions have always known how to develop individual consciousness. The scientific tradition has always known how to develop collective knowledge. What this phase of awakening gropes toward is something that has not quite existed before, the development of collective consciousness, not the homogenization of thought, but a quality of shared attention, a global capacity to hold complexity without collapsing it, to be moved by what is actually happening in the world without being swept away by it. We do not know if this is possible. We do not know if it will happen. History does not guarantee progress, and the forces organized against expanded consciousness are formidable and entrenched. The same cognitive tools that make rational inquiry possible also make propaganda possible. The same capacity for mythic meaning that gave prehistoric humans a way to face death also gave 20th century demagogues their most powerful weapon. Every phase of awakening is also a new surface for sleep. This is the most honest thing that can be said about where humanity currently stands. We are not at the end of anything. We are somewhere in the middle of a story whose ending is unknown. The technologies that connect 8 billion people instantaneously could facilitate the emergence of something like collective wisdom, the shared inquiry, the pooling of hard-won understanding across traditions and disciplines, the global conversation that includes the voices that previous eras systematically excluded. Or those same technologies could facilitate the most effective systems of mass manipulation and collective narcosis ever devised. Both things are happening. Both will continue. What determines which one gains ground is not policy or technology. It is the quality of attention that individual human beings bring to their own experience, and whether they are awake to what is actually happening inside them and around them, or, as Gurdjieff said, simply dreaming they are awake.